Uncle Meat is in the basement of his secret laboratory. The lights are dim. All around the basement, mysterious wires and cables dangle over, out of, around, and through an unlikely collection of dust-covered desks, trunks, umbrella stands, and a huge maroon sofa, terminating in a fake maple bookcase like you might get if you ordered the whole Collier's Encyclopedia at one time. Stu, which is Uncle Meat's first name, crouches malignantly near the bookcase, fumbling through a stack of books, records, newspaper clippings, religious pamphlets, and campaign buttons. He applies light friction to the rash on his throat, muttering, "Yes, yes, it's all here, every bit of it, everything I need to create my greatest masterpiece." Greetings, vinyl community. This is the story of Frank Zappa's album, The Grand Wazoo, released in 1972. And in 1970 through 71, Zappa had been touring with a bawdy, comedy-oriented incarnation of the Mothers, fronted by vocalists Mark Volman and Howard Kalin, alias Flo and Eddie, both formerly of the Turtles. This band came to an abrupt end in December 1971 when Zappa was assaulted on stage by a deranged audience member at the Rainbow Theatre in London. Zappa fell 10 to 15 feet into a concrete-floored orchestra pit, with a monitor toppling over on top of him for good measure, and suffered a concussion, multiple broken bones, and other injuries. Zappa spent the first half of 1972 recuperating, but he wasn't idle. He wrote a set of ambitious, jazz-oriented compositions and assembled a big band to play them. Drummer Ainsley Dunbar and keyboardists George Duke and Don Preston were veterans of the previous Mothers lineups, as was Jeff Simmons, who turned up to contribute Hawaiian guitar and vocals to one track. Tony Duran was brought in on slide guitar, and on bass was Alex Dmochowski from Ainsley Dunbar's own band, The Retaliation. Dmochowski was in the United States illegally on an expired visa, so he was not credited by name on the albums. The name used for the bass player was Erroneous, which will fit in with the sort of mock Roman atmosphere of the Grand Wazoo album, as we will see. And assorted horn players were recruited from the local musicians union. Recording sessions were booked for April and May of 1972, with the still recovering Zappa directing the proceedings from his wheelchair. These sessions resulted in 2 albums, Waka Jawaka, released July 5th, 1972, and The Grand Wazoo, released November 27th, 1972. Waka Jawaka appeared as a drastic change in direction from the comedy routines of the most recent Mothers albums. The cover identifies it as a sequel to the 1969 Zappa album Hot Rats, which was also a jazz-inflected project. And the label of the album, on Zappa's own Bizarre label, does credit it to Frank Zappa and Hot Rats as a band name. And in case anyone gets the wrong idea about the potted plant on the back cover, it is identified with a misspelled label showing the scientific name Aurelia elegantissima. There's Frank in his nice sweater vest, which went up for auction recently. Some lucky person actually owns this vest that he's wearing. Okay, the album begins with the sidelong track Big Swifty, a jazzed-up instrumental with shifting time signatures. This track features just the basic rock band, with Sal Marquez playing multiple trumpets via overdub. When the theme returns towards the end of the piece, Marquez plays a harmonized version of it over a 4/4 beat, so he changes the whole rhythmic structure of the piece and works it all out in harmony with himself in what Zappa described as a prom night harmony. Marquez was definitely one of the most valuable players in the Grand Wazoo and Waka Jawaka sessions, and he did go on to become a member of Zappa's regular touring band when he returned to the standard rock band format in 1973. Side 2 begins with Your Mouth, which is a sleazy, grinding blues with vocals, one of the 2 vocal tracks on the album, the other being the next track, It Just Might Be a One-Shot Deal, which is a charmingly weird confection with surreal lyrics about a frog and a sublime, sparkling pedal steel guitar solo by Sneaky Pete Kleinow, best known from the Flying Burrito Brothers. And the 4th and final track is another epic jazz instrumental, the title track, Waka Jawaka, with 4 horn players all overdubbing multiple parts, and a sequence at the end, again, where Sal Marquez overdubs multiple trumpets, this time on a transcribed version of Zappa's guitar solo. So you hear the solo itself being improvised by Zappa and also harmonized by the overdubbed trumpets. And here's the inner sleeve for the Bizarre label. Forgot to show that earlier. The follow-up, Grand Wazoo, released towards the end of the year, brings to bear the full glory of the big band, with 24 musicians contributing. Although Zappa had referred to the band itself as the Grand Wazoo or the Grand Wazoo Orchestra, the album is credited to the Mothers. It's packaged in a gatefold sleeve with artwork by longtime Zappa associate Cal Schenkel. Folds out to show the saga of Uncle Meat himself, who we heard in the intro, Stew Meat. Haha. This is depicting a musical battle between 2 ancient cultures, sort of a takeoff on ancient Rome and Babylon and the Assyrians and all those sort of folks. The army of Cletus Aurelius Auritus, the funky emperor, armed with horns and guitars, are repelling the forces of mediocrities of pedestrium, who are wielding violins. The back cover is full of Zappa's conceptual continuity, as he called it. Little clues, callbacks to previous releases, and hints of forthcoming releases, things that will be developed later. The main character there is Stew Meat, Uncle Meat, and we even see a mutation of that Aurelia from the back cover of Waka Jawaka, this time having sprouted some eyeballs and identified as Aurelia puckered rictus. The first song, For Calvin and His Next 2 Hitchhikers, opens the proceedings with a woozy, drunken-sounding intro, and the only lyrics on the album, vocals by Janet Neville Ferguson, who had appeared as one of the groupies in the movie 200 Motels, released just before this period, and Sal Marquez, the trumpeter, also doing vocals. They had both also sung on Waka Jawaka. The lyrics tell the true story of 2 strangers who invited themselves one night into cover artist Cal Schenkel's car, made themselves at home, made some sandwiches, and eventually went on their way. There is a meandering improvisational section. There's a quote from a forthcoming Zappa composition, New Brown Clouds, a portion of his epic Gregory Peccary. Composed, thorny arrangement that's a trademark of Frank Zappa's, with a brief trombone solo, and finally an instrumental reprise of the opening. This is performed by an 18-piece version of the band, plus the vocalists, and is followed by the title track, Grand Wazoo, which is also identified as Think It Over on some reissues. The first half was completely changed for later editions. On CD, most CD issues will have the track Think It Over or Grand Wazoo first, and For Calvin and his next two hitchhikers second. But the original format was to have the one vocal piece first and the lengthy Grand Wazoo second. Grand Wazoo is a bright, bouncy shuffle with plenty of soloing. It begins with a bubbly, slippery guitar solo by Frank Zappa with some of his characteristic electronic effects on the guitar to give it a really unique tone. And that's followed by a beautifully orchestrated version of the main theme. And the theme is composed to incorporate a short solo section. So actually part of the theme is a guitar solo by Tony Duran. And we hear a quote from the 7/8 lick from Big Swifty from the previous album. Solos for trombone and muted trumpet, very extended, slithery sounding trumpet solo, backed by a peppy, percolating rhythm and a lot increasingly weird grumbling sounds going on in the background. When people are soloing, there's still so much happening behind them. You're not just listening to the solo, because the drumming is amazing, the backing instrumentals are amazing, and there are just these unusual sounds building up. We hear a quote from the Little Egypt theme, which is better known to schoolboys as There's a Place in France Where the Ladies Do a Dance, or Where the Ladies Don't Wear Pants, or any of a number of variations. And after an epic drum fill, we get a reprise of the main theme, this time with the set-aside improvisation section being a mini Moog solo by Don Preston. The track Grand Wazoo was also incorporated into another project that Frank Zappa worked on in 1972, which was a Broadway musical titled Hunchin' Toot, which was completed but never staged. So that is the reason for the title change from Grand Wazoo to Think It Over. Think It Over is part of the lyrics written for the tune Grand Wazoo. And to add to the confusion, there is another completely unrelated Frank Zappa recording titled The Grand Wazoo that was released posthumously, and which consists of Captain Beefheart reciting a story backed by overdubbed synclavier electronics by Zappa. Okay, side 2 of Grand Wazoo opens with the rollicking track Cletus Auritus Auritus, which you'll remember is the name of the funky emperor who can be seen here wielding the mystery horn. Great tune with barrel house piano from George Duke and a cheerful vocal chorus or refrain with Zappa doing a solo of basso profundo rum-pum-pums, and a saxophone solo by Ernie Watts, a veteran who was known for one thing as the saxophone player for the Rolling Stones on at least one of their tours. This track, Cletus Auritus, was released as a single from the album, backed with an edited version of the next track that we'll get to, Eat That Question. There's the promotional white label version of the same single, only with Cletus Auritus Auritus on both sides, in mono and stereo versions, and an Italian version with a picture sleeve depicting the late 60s Mothers of Invention, only Don Preston having any relevance to these recordings. Even though he's not on this particular track, he at least is on the album. Eat That Question itself opens with some tentative and mysterious electric piano noodling from George Duke, before resolving into a theme led by the piano and a solo section with an eerie electronic passage, very dark wah-wah meditation on the theme statement by Zappa, and finally a powerful polyrhythmic march that just really explodes out of the speakers. The title is a pun on Eat That Christian, which ties in with the mock Roman civilizations of the Grand Wazoo story. I don't think I even mentioned the story. That's what we heard from. Zappa did write a story about the mythology of the Grand Wazoo, of the Mystery Horn, the armies that held battles of the bands, and the anti-musical forces known as Questions, who were taken to the Colosseum, and after being offered a chance to redeem themselves, regretfully disposed of. The album ends with the lovely jazz waltz Blessed Relief, with a relaxed skipping melody for trumpet, guitar, baritone sax. Again, beautiful orchestration by Zappa. He really knew how to combine instrumental colors. Flute and electric piano flutter like birds over the theme statement, and it's just a gorgeous, relaxing, as the title says, bit of relief from the musical intensity, although it certainly bears a great quantity of musical content. It's very involving listening, as is the whole album. And it is in a waltz time, which many of Zappa's most engaging tunes are in 3/4 time. The opening track, For Calvin, was in a slow 3/4. There was a rough cassette recording of rehearsals for the Grand Wazoo recording sessions, and that was released posthumously in 2004 as a CD, Joe's Dommage. In September, between the releases of Waka Jawaka and Grand Wazoo, Zappa assembled a touring version of the Grand Wazoo Orchestra and did just a handful of shows in the USA and Europe. It was a 20-piece band, including many of the same horn players from the album, as well as some newcomers, and returning veteran mother Ian Underwood on synthesizer, and his wife Ruth Underwood on percussion. The original rhythm section that appears on both albums, Ainsley Dunbar and Alex Mochowski, was replaced by Jim Gordon on drums and Dave Parlato on bass. And the final show of the tour from Boston's Music Hall on September 24th was released on CD in 2007 as Wazoo. At the conclusion of the Grand Wazoo tour, Zappa reduced the band to a 10-piece. The lineup was now just 6 horns, 2 guitars, bass, and drums. Tony Duran on slide being the second guitarist. And he dubbed this configuration the Petit Wazoo. And although they toured for the rest of the year, the band never made any studio recording, and no live recordings of the band were released until the posthumous period when they released a lot of things from the vault. But we did get in 2006 the double CD Imaginary Diseases, followed 10 years later in 2016 by Little Dots. So those albums are the first time that incarnation of Zappa's band was documented. So that's the story of the Grand Wazoo in 1972 in the world of Frank Zappa. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Be well. Talk with you again soon. Bye-bye for now.